Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I'm hosting a debate. It's more of an informal discussion between Apostate Prophet and Randal Rauser. So Apostate Prophet, he is an ex-Muslim atheist. He's got a YouTube channel that's just called Apostate Prophet, and the reason why he goes by that name is because it's easier to pronounce than his actual name. That's at least what I understand. Randal, he's a Christian. He's been on our channel a bunch. He's had discussions with several different people, including Dan Barker, on our channel. And so let's just get into it. So if you want to learn more about my guests, check the links in the description. I don't want to take a whole lot of time at the beginning. I want to just jump right in to dialogue. And today we're talking about the afterlife. We're debating really what's going to happen. I'll just kind of lay it out for you. Like I said, it's an informal discussion. Randall's going to talk for about 5 minutes, lay out his view. Apostate, he's going to lay out his view for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to switch to just sort of informal dialogue for the rest of the time until we get to Q&A for the last 30 minutes of the show. So if you have a question for either one of my guests, if you want to put it in the live chat, you can. I'll try to be keeping an eye on it. If you send it as a super chat, it's a lot easier for me to pull up and save and everything and get on the channel later on. So just to let you know, that's what's going on there. All right, with that, why don't we go ahead and figure out why Apostate is leaning underneath his desk before we start. You good, buddy?
I'm fine. Yeah, I was just trying to reach some wires.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get started with Randal. Unless you guys have you want to say hi to each other.
Oh, hi. Yeah.
Thank you guys for coming on. All right, let's just get started. So let's have Randal. Why don't you go first?
All right. I'd like to thank you, Cameron, for having me on, and to Apostate Prophet for agreeing to participate as well in this exchange. There's an old saying, tell me about the God you don't believe in, because I probably don't believe in him either. The point is that often skeptical positions toward Christian belief are born by misunderstanding of those beliefs. And so we can go a significant way toward addressing the skepticism if we begin by addressing the misunderstanding. Well, there's a lot of misunderstanding about Christian views of the afterlife, and it isn't all the skeptics' fault. A lot of that misunderstanding exists among Christians. So let me provide a quick overview of eternity, not limited to the views popular among groups such as North American conservative evangelicals, but rather the big picture of eternity, that which is shared by mere Christians across the globe and down through the ages. I want to begin with the words of the great 19th century abolitionist Theodore Parker. He wrote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." Those words, famously adopted by Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. That's the beginning of a Christian understanding of eternity. The wheat and tares grow together even now, but God's kingdom will come, his people, under his rule in his land. So how does it come about? Well, it begins with the second coming of Christ. Acts 1:11, the angel says, this same Jesus who is taken up into heaven will come back the same way. And then the general resurrection, the point at which all human beings are brought back to life, body and soul, Daniel 12:2, some to life and some to judgment. What is the nature of that judgment? Christians have always agreed that there is a posthumous judgment for those outside Christ, that is, after death. But they have disagreed about the nature and end or purpose of that judgment. We can find three views represented throughout church history, all dating back to the patristic era from about 100 to 500 AD. Eternal conscious torment, annihilationism, and universalism. Eternal conscious torment is the view that the general resurrection results in those that are outside Christ being subjected to an eternal punishment in body and soul. Torment. Annihilationism is the view that the general resurrection results in those outside Christ ultimately ceasing to exist, being destroyed. And universalism is the view that the period of posthumous judgment, we call hell, is not punitive, but rather is restorative, and that the suffering endured by those outside Christ ultimately is to the end of bringing them back into relationship with God the Father through Christ. Now, I am an annihilationist, so I believe in the resurrection to a judgment that results in the cessation of existence. But I'm also a hopeful universalist. In other words, I hope I'm wrong and that all are ultimately restored to Christ. As even J.I. Packer put it, and he's a conservative Anglican, he said, if you want to see people damned, there is something wrong with you. Now, each view of these three has a theological tradition supporting biblical texts and philosophical and theological arguments. That's the resurrection to judgment. What about resurrection to life? Well, here's where we talk about heaven. Heaven is not the Greek empyrean, an otherworldly incorporeal destination of clouds and harps or Platonic forms. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, it is rather a new heaven and new earth. That is the language for the coming of the kingdom of God in Isaiah 66 and 2 Peter 3 and Revelation 21. I wrote a book defending that understanding, and in fact, arguing that the new heavens and new earth should be understood to be the original heavens and earth that were created, being resurrected into eternal life, just as our physical bodies are resurrected into eternal life. And that comes from Romans 8:19 to 21, for example. And so I argue that we ought to understand heaven in eternity as earth multiplied by perfection. In other words, our end goal is to exist with God in perfect community, as described in Revelation 21, as creation achieving the final purposes and fulfilling the glory for which God purposed it from the beginning of time. And finally, we get to the so what. What difference does this all make? To quote Maximus from Gladiator, what we do in life echoes in eternity. Your life now, the choices you make, they echo into eternity. Each one of us is invited now to get on the right side of history, to join God on mission in bringing about works of the kingdom. In the words of Micah 6:8, to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Because his kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven. The arc of history is long, but it does bend toward justice.
So that impression was amazing, but let's now turn it over to Apostate Prophet. You've got about 5 minutes to lay out what your view is and some of the issues that you've got with the Christian view of theology, or of the afterlife, and in particular with Randal's conception, or just whatever you want to say about it. And then we'll move to, as I said, informal dialogue, and then some Q&A. So here we go. Whenever you're ready.
Sure. Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Randal, for that. Thanks for agreeing to this, and thanks for the presentation. And thanks everyone for joining and listening and contributing to this discussion. First off, I want to say that I don't want to be here to. We agreed to have an informal discussion, and I find that very good for such a discussion, for the one that we are having right now. My intention is never to have a structured debate and to make sure that we dominate and defeat the other side, especially when it comes to the matter of God and afterlife. That is definitely not what I'm aiming for. I really just want to sit down here and try to understand each other, try to really figure out whether I'm wrong on something or not, or whether my opponent, I don't even want to say opponent, or whether the person that I'm speaking to is right or wrong on this matter. So I just want that to be clear. I really don't want to defeat anybody today. I want to spend a lot of time thinking about the afterlife, thinking about God, thinking about the possibility of life outside of this reality, of an origin or a creator of things, of an afterlife or annihilation, and so on. I've come to my conclusions over the years. I grew up as a Muslim. I grew up in a very religious Muslim family. I personally believed in a God. I, at some point, devoted myself to this God, and to hoping for a good afterlife, hoping for justice in the hereafter, and so on and so forth. I abandoned that faith at some point. I went on to explore afterlife, to explore belief, faith, justice in different circles. I've come to the conclusion that it simply does not make sense to believe in that. And I am very much convinced of that. And I really just want to clear that, really just want to discuss that with all honesty today. Now, there are some things that I have a problem with when it comes to the Christian belief, or in general, the Abrahamic belief, or the monotheistic belief. belief of in a God and in the afterlife. That criticism is so long. I could not possibly pack this into 5 minutes, but I could address a few things before we start our honest discussion. So the traditional belief would be that we are in this world, in this life. We live through this life, which is a temporary life, a life that currently averages in the West to about 70 years or so. And after this life, depending on what we have done during this life, depending on our deeds or our belief, we will be judged and then brought into a new world. Now, whether you want to see that world as a separate world from this one or as a world within this world, a new world, is pretty much irrelevant. But the view is that in the hereafter, you will be judged and placed accordingly based on how you lived your life in this temporary life. Now, different Christian beliefs and different religions have different interpretations on how that will go. Some will say this: your afterlife depends on whether you believed in a specific teaching or not. Some will say it will depend on your acts and your your deeds and your sins. Others will say you will not go to hell, you will not be punished, you will be annihilated, and so on. Others will say everyone will eventually be judged under the same standards and will receive a chance to go to the good place after they die, no matter what they were, no matter what they believed in. But eventually, it all boils down to the idea that this life is temporary. This life that we have, this flesh, this life, this conscious life that we all perceive, that we all know, this is temporary. And after this, depending on what we have done, something will happen to us and life will continue. But as far as we can see, that is entirely based on myths, based on assumptions that were made by humans for thousands of years now, always in the hopes that that soon the day will come where we all will be gathered, where we all will be judged, where we all will go to a place. But such an assumption has always been based on a lack of evidence, a lack of logic, a lack of reasoning, a lack of proper findings. It has always been only dependent on assumptions, on what we want to believe. We want to believe that we won't just die and disappear. No, life has to go on somehow. We have to somehow go somewhere. Or the people who have done grave injustices or who have done good things shouldn't just go unnoticed. No, they should be punished or rewarded in some afterlife, because we don't want to accept that people just get away with doing bad things or don't get rewarded for being amazing people. But again, these are all just assumptions, and we can of course come to what I haven't really addressed. What my major problem with all of this is, the problem is that there is a grave injustice in the belief of an afterlife in and of itself. But I believe I have even come to 5 minutes right now, so I don't want to keep rambling about this.
Stop your rambling.
We can just freely discuss this.
Yeah, let's get into some open dialogue. So let's turn over to Randal, because Apostate, you just went for a little while. So Randal, any comments, and then we'll just get the dialogue flowing.
Sure. Well, yeah, there's a lot. So of course you didn't really unpack some of the injustice issues at the end. So I'll leave you to do that afterwards. A couple things you said. One is made a claim. Well, you said this is based on myths, assumptions. And then you also suggested that it's a result of wish fulfillment. So first of all, in terms of myths and assumptions, as a Christian, I mean, I actually defend or provide arguments for God's existence, provide arguments for the resurrection of Jesus and other aspects of a Christian worldview. And this comes along as part of that package. So for example, central to my description of the afterlife was the concept of resurrection. But as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, the resurrection of Jesus is the first fruits of our future resurrection, or the resurrection of creation, if I'm right in understanding the heavens and the earth as the completion of this heaven and this earth. So in fact, that's where it all begins, evidentially, is you make an argument for the historical resurrection of Jesus, and that can be part of then a basis to extrapolate that, well, then these other teachings about that Jesus gave us, we have reason and warrant to accept them as well. So there's that aspect. In terms of wish fulfillment, I think certain aspects of the story I described certainly are wonderful and glorious. That doesn't mean that the beliefs themselves are generated by wish fulfillment, however. You're sort of assuming that just because they're favorable, that we would like the world to be that way, that it therefore is wish fulfillment. You have to fill in the blanks there and show why that is in fact wish fulfillment. The other thing is, in terms of wish fulfillment, judgment, resurrection of judgment is not part of anyone's wish fulfillment, I suspect, right? So that asks something quite contrary to what we would all hope to be true. I said, I hope universalism is true. I don't at this point think it's true. So, I mean, right there's an example where it's not part of my wish fulfillment. So, I mean, those are some initial thoughts.
The thing is, Randal, I mean, you say this will go into a different perspective of what we actually want to discuss, but I just want to briefly address that because we went into it. But since I said it is mostly based on myths and assumptions, you say that you have proof and or you have proving points or evidence, and you have, for example, the resurrection and certain things that serve to convince people of the truth of an afterlife or convince people of the existence of God. But evidently, this is not enough, is it? I mean, most people in the world do not believe in Christianity. Most people do not believe in the one God. Even most people who associate themselves with this belief in Christianity or with monotheism do not really care about God, but merely keep that as a passive characteristic in their lives. And using the resurrection or using certain pieces of evidence for God as evidence and then arguing that this is clear proof that the afterlife exists clearly doesn't work, does it? Because I mean we see it didn't work for me. It doesn't work for many other people. It doesn't work for millions, for billions of people in the world. I mean, it is just something that might satisfy the someone who already believes in God, but it is not something that will satisfy most people. And we are speaking of most people when we are speaking of an afterlife where most people will be judged or, rewarded or punished. And what would be the point of that proof? It doesn't really serve any great purpose.
Okay, first of all, I didn't use the word proof, although the word proof does have different definitions in different contexts. If you're in a civil court proceeding, proof is by a preponderance of the evidence. That's quite low. It's just more likely than not. If you're in a criminal proceeding, proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. And then there are such things as logical proofs, which are something that no rational person could deny, where the conclusion follows deductively from the premises. So, but I didn't use the word proof anyway. I just talked about, these are evidential grounds on which one can believe. Now, your rebuttal as well, those are not good grounds because not everybody accepts your view. But of course, you're cutting off the branch you're sitting on when you do that, because there are many more people who accept my views than accept your views. So if my arguments are bad for that reason, your arguments are a lot worse.
I know, but my views are not based on, my views are not supposed to be universally accepted. Yours are. So it doesn't really matter whether mine are universally convincing or not.
Well, I thought that what you were appealing to here was an epistemic principle by which we identify good arguments. The principle being that a good argument should be one that persuades everybody who considers it, but that's clearly not the case.
No, I mean the issue is we can lengthily talk about what makes an argument good or what makes an argument bad. The issue is that your arguments are supposed to convince humanity. All of us will be judged, as far as I understand, and all of us will have an afterlife, as far as I understand, according to the beliefs of Christianity and other religions. So your proof, which you want to present, by which people should then believe in an afterlife, should universally be convincing, but they are not. They don't even convince half of humankind. They don't even convince a minority of humankind. They simply serve to convince few people who already believe in this religion. I mean, they don't really serve any purpose. So there is no actual proof. They
certainly would. They do actually at least convince a minority clearly. But the thing is, you're imputing to me a particular claim that I've not defended. And that's the claim that for my arguments to be good, they should be universally persuasive. I've never made such a claim. And if you are suggesting that that is an implication of Christian belief, please explain on what basis you believe that universal compulsion in the acceptance of an argument should be something I'm committed to as a Christian.
Okay, so we have a belief in an afterlife, and you do believe that everyone is subject to this transition from this temporary life to the afterlife, right? I mean, it's not just a matter of Christians; it's everyone, even the person in China, even somebody in North Korea, will be subject to this same process, right? That's
Sure.
what you believe. So, but
Yeah.
yeah. So the issue here is we have a belief in an afterlife that is. We went into this because I briefly mentioned that this belief in an afterlife is a myth, that it is based on assumptions, and you then said that you have supporting evidence for these myths, for these assumptions, which is why I argued that these supporting evidences, that these supporting evidential grounds are not really relevant because they don't really they're not universally convincing. They simply serve to reaffirm your own beliefs. But this transition from the temporary life to an afterlife should also apply to the Chinese person around the world, to the North Korean person, to the average atheist in Iceland, to somebody in I don't know, in Saudi Arabia, in Afghanistan, in somewhere in the middle of Africa. I mean, to those people, this whole belief in the afterlife and this whole belief in a monotheistic God is merely a myth, and they don't have any ground on which they can be convinced. They only have you. You could bring them your arguments, but in the end, it would just be you preaching to them, right? I mean, they don't really, they are not judged by the same standards as you are in a Christian society. So how is it logical? How is it reasonable that we are in this world of billions of people, 7 billion, 8 billion people, and we have this belief in the afterlife that is dominant in some parts of the world and completely lacking in other parts of the world, but we are supposed to believe that this is the universal mission of God?
Okay, well, so on the one hand, I think we can leave aside the claim that I'm committed to the view that everybody must universally find my arguments compelling for them to be good, because that has just never been my claim, and it's not an implication of Christian belief. I do think that what
we
you
can get
are,
rid of that.
yeah. So I think what you are kind of backing into here is a related issue, which is the issue of how does God judge people? What's the basis under which God judges people? Um, so we have a passage such as Romans 12, or sorry, Romans 2, 12 to 14. So I'll just read that. Uh, Paul says, all who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who are declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required of the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. So one thing Paul is clearly appealing to here is the idea that God judges people relative to the degree of light they've been given, the degree of information that they've been exposed to. Do they have some degree of general revelation for which they're held accountable? Do they have some degree of special revelation, some encounter with Scripture, the encounter with God's Holy Spirit, for which they're accountable? And those are the issues that God sorts out and that I don't need to sort out. So the issue as to how God judges every specific person, one thing we can know is that he always does it with maximal justice and fairness, because God desires that the maximal number of people should be saved and reconciled to him that possibly can be saved. That he's not going to kind of just pull the wool over someone's eyes and then trick them and say, ha ha, you missed your chance. Rather, he will judge each person on the light that they've been given.
But I don't understand the point of that. I have never understood the point of that. I mean, if God wanted people to believe, if that was the purpose of creation, if God, or if God wants to save humans, if God wants people to be saved, if God wants people to go to heaven, then why is it that we are in the year 2021, and the one belief in God, or the true belief, is, from no matter what perspective you're looking at, still a minority belief. It is still not a majority belief. Most people are not concerned with this belief. As said, I like to give the example of China, for example, but in China, it is almost irrelevant whether you believe in God or not. No one cares. The average Chinese person does not believe in God. If you go out there and explain that you do not believe in God and why you do not believe in God, people will not care, because nobody is Nobody even cares about that question. It is not an existential question to them. It is an existential question to you. So if it was God's purpose to save people, and if salvation is through Christianity, through Christ, then why are not most people concerned with this issue? Why is this such a geographical matter? Why is this restricted by such geographical, chronological boundaries?
Okay, it seems at that point that we're moving from the question of inclusivism versus exclusivism to another issue, which is divine hiddenness. So if there is a God who desires to reveal himself to all people, then why is God seemingly hidden at some points? And this, of course, this was an argument for atheism that was developed by J.L. Schellenberg in the early 1990s, and there's a vast literature on it. One response, which I think is an unsatisfactory response, is just to say that God is in fact revealed fully to everybody, and those who claim not to know God or have to know that there is a God or that he's revealed himself to them, that they are sinfully suppressing his revelation to them. So I wrote a book called Is the Atheist My Neighbor, where I critique that idea. And I mean, there may be certainly instances where God has revealed himself to a person and they are refusing to accept that revelation. But I also know other people, including many Christians, who wrestle with the hiddenness of God. Mother Teresa, in her journals at the end of her life, they were published after her death, she talks about questioning even if there is a God. And I think it would be very mistaken to think that every time someone wrestles with those kinds of questions, they do so out of a sinful rebellion. So God does seem to be hidden at times. And then the question is, well, what are the bases under which God might be hidden? And there is certainly, again, a vast literature on that. One of the things that I would just point out is that people can be in relationship with God in various ways, perhaps in ways without even knowing it. So, for example, just as an infant can have an intimate relationship with their mother without having any cognitive awareness of their mother as such. So I think God can begin to meet people in various different ways and begin to interact with them without them even being aware that it is God with whom they are interacting. So, for example, a person, they say, well, I don't think that there's a God, but I think that there is an absolute rightness, an absolute form of the good, like Plato talked about. And I live my life profoundly in accord with the form of the good, and I seek to love my neighbor as myself. Well, maybe to some degree, that person is already entering into some degree of relationship with God, even though they're not aware of it as such, but they're doing so under the limited and fallible notion of this form of the good by which they seek to live their life. So that when they finally do become a Christian, they'll say, oh, this is the fulfillment of that which I was working toward.
Isn't that but the thing is, I recently listened to a conversion story of a former Christian to Islam, and he was talking about how his entire life he felt this presence and he felt this purpose and he felt this truth somewhere, and he couldn't find it within Christianity, he couldn't find it within this. And when he read the Quran, he noticed, oh, this is what I have been looking for all my life. This is what I've felt all my life. And suddenly this peace and purpose and everything filled me, and I felt that this is absolutely the truth. Nothing can convince me otherwise. So that guy was basically describing that he found the truth, which he felt his entire life, which is basically something that you are just describing. You could apply that same apply the same thing to Christianity, to Islam, to other beliefs. Someone who believes in Taoism, which is quite which Western people are quite unfamiliar with, could say, oh yeah, I have felt the way, the Tao, the origin of all things. So no matter what your beliefs are, you could simply convince yourself that you are upon the truth, but there is no actual knowledge, no actual wisdom, no actual evidence to that. I mean, you said there are responses to the hiddenness of God, and those responses are many of those responses are not very satisfying. I think none of the responses are satisfying. I think there is no satisfying response, because I think the challenge is very simple. I mean, if God created us, if God wants us to be good, if God wants us to be saved, if God wants us to go to Him, then why would it be so difficult to achieve that? Why would it be a matter? Why would it be a test? Why would it be a challenge? I mean, God could make it very simple. God could simply I don't know, appear in the sky, say, "Hey, I'm God. Follow my commandments, follow this and that, do this and that, and then you will be with me. If you want to be with me, come here." But instead, it is not a matter of wanting; it is a matter of belief, a matter of being convinced or unconvinced. Most people who don't believe are simply not convinced, which is why they do not believe. So, and we have to trust some sources that were revealed 3,000, 2,000 years ago, and have to go through a chain of people who witnessed other people who witnessed other people who witnessed some guy resurrecting from the dead. And so you see, I mean, it could be just so much easier. There is no reason for it to be so hidden and such a challenge. There is no purpose for it to be so difficult.
Okay, so first of all, you talked about conversion. Well, here's an example. You said, here's a Muslim who had a conversion, or a person who had a conversion to Islam. Okay, I've read many atheists who describe something similar. So, for example, in John Loftus's book, Why I Became an Atheist, he quotes a guy named Ex-Believer who says, "I was once a Christian and I was drinking from the Christian fountain of life, just like John Piper said. And then eventually I realized that that fountain was filth and I left it behind and everything changed and now I'm an atheist." Okay, so there's a conversion experience to atheism. Does that undercut atheism? Everybody, we all have conversion experiences, paradigm shifts. Some of them are sudden, some of them are very gradual. But I don't find anything evidentially substantive in the fact of that. Because again, I think you're cutting the branch off that you're sitting on if you're going to say because there are conversion experiences to other views that therefore of itself undercuts my view. Because of course there are atheists that leave atheism and become Christians. So does that undercut atheism? No. So then it seems to me that you're sort of assuming the falsity of the view. So you assert that these are all myths, but you've provided no evidence, except you said, well, the evidence of disagreement. That's not of itself evidence. Now, in terms of hiddenness, divine hiddenness, you said you've looked at all the arguments. You've looked at Michael Ray's Gifford lectures, for example. So
No, I
in his
haven't said
gift,
that.
you haven't looked at them. Okay.
I haven't said
there's
I
an
looked at all of
example.
them.
Okay, so then I would say that maybe hold off on rendering sweeping judgments as to the viability of the Christian rebuttals as to divine hiddenness until you have looked at more of them. I do think that Michael Ray's survey of responses in his Gifford lectures, which are available online as video format, are an excellent place for anyone to start. I gave a written rebuttal to J.L. Schellenberg on my website. And part of my response is indeed what I was just talking about, which I think is perfectly legitimate, to point out that often when we think God is hidden, God is already at that point revealing himself to people. If they truly are open, they may ultimately find that they were to some degree in relationship with him even prior to the point where they had their official conversion. And I gave you an example in terms of the person who's living in accord with the Platonic good and actually trying to love their neighbor as Jesus told us to in Matthew 25:31-46, then they may ultimately just realize later that when you were hidden from me, you were actually revealing yourself to me. The big question is this: can God have morally sufficient reasons to withhold the fullest revelation of himself from a particular person at a particular time? And if you want to claim that God cannot have a morally sufficient reason to do that, well, then the onus is on you to provide an argument, because you're the one now making the positive claim that God cannot have a morally sufficient reason to withhold his full revelation. So then the question will be, what's your argument?
I think we have a big misunderstanding here. I am not saying that that cannot happen. I'm not saying that this is not true. I'm not saying I have absolute proof that God cannot connect to certain people. My entire point with the conversion to Islam was simply to raise some skepticism to your argument that God can establish a connection with people without revealing himself directly to them. Like, for example, when somebody says, "I feel this deep, true, superior sense of goodness," or "I feel this connection," and that might indeed be God revealing himself to them. That was your argument, and I'm just saying that it's easy for you to say if you believe that to be true, but everyone can say that. I mean, a Muslim can make the same argument, a Buddhist can make the same argument, a Taoist can make the same argument. People who don't believe in God, who believe in some different force, can make the same argument. It's not really an argument. It is just an assumption. It is just it is just an argument to make yourself feel better about a belief that is again unsubstantiated. There is no reasoning. There is no proper proof behind it. There's nothing behind it, just an assumption that might be God connecting to a person without revealing himself. But we don't really see that happening, right? I mean, I'm not saying no, that is absolutely untrue. I'm not saying I have absolute proof that this is not true. I'm just saying that that your argument doesn't have any proof. It is simply an assumption.
I'm not sure why you keep using the word proof, right? Because I already said, first of all, it's an unhelpful word because it has different definitions. It does seem to me that rhetorically, what you're doing when you keep using the word proof is to try to put me into a corner as having to provide a certain standard of evidence, a very high one that would compel you, so that then you can say, if I have failed to provide proof as you've demanded, then my arguments are not good. But of course, I'm not obliged to do that. The goal here is not to persuade you, but the goal is to provide reasonable rebuttals to your claims. So you made claims about divine hiddenness, that all the arguments fail. I asked you, well, have you looked at Mike Ray's arguments? You said no. So you don't know, then all the arguments have failed. I provided some explanation as to why God would hide himself in terms of developing a relationship with a person over time. And I pointed out that you actually do have an evidential burden. If you want to say that divine hiddenness arguments aren't good, or sorry, that divine hiddenness is a problem for the theist, you have to actually argue a positive position to show that God cannot have reasonable, morally sufficient grounds to withhold the full revelation of himself to people. And you haven't done that. So I don't think that divine hiddenness then is a good defeater to my beliefs, because I think I provided arguments as to why we shouldn't accept it.
I think I don't know why you are perceiving this hostile approach from me. I'm not trying to do that. I'm not trying to.
I'm not saying hostile. I do think that rhetorically, to talk about the language of proof does frame the exchange so that I have a very high standard.
So
I'm not saying
when I say proof, I'm just my objection is just this. For example, somebody tells me, well, there is this giant thing flying out there in the outer space that is controlling us all, and this is just a sign that is true. And I will then just say, well, that is just your assumption. That's just what you want to believe. You don't really have any proper grounds, any proof to convince me of the truth of that. And that is all I'm doing. I'm not trying to force you to present proof. I'm just saying it is merely an assumption that you have.
You just said of that hypothetical person, well, that's just what you want to believe. How do you know that's just what they want to believe? I mean, you've actually made a positive assertion here. You made an evidential claim. You only believe that because that's what you want to believe. But what's your basis for making that claim?
Well, if you believe in something, if you want to argue for something to be true, then there should be a proper ground for you to argue that is true. There should be a foundation, a basis for that. But if you are going to make a claim that is just that is unfalsifiable, irrefutable, that is impossible to fact check, that is simply in alignment with your own beliefs, then all I can say about it is it seems that you are simply making an assumption. Now, if I also argue that is just something that you do because you want to believe in that is my opinion, of course. But it appears to me that it is a fact that it is merely an assumption because there is no foundation to it. There is no proof to it. That's what I mean by proof.
Okay, so you said that you are justified in concluding that person who makes that claim is only making it because they want to. And the two reasons, I may have missed some others, but at least two reasons you gave was because that belief is in accord with their other beliefs. Although you didn't actually make that clear. You said they just simply made one belief and that's all you've heard from them. So you don't actually know in that context what their additional beliefs are, such that this is consistent with those other beliefs. And then you said, well, if it's unfalsifiable, well, then you only want to believe it and that's why you hold it. And I'm wondering, you did reference unfalsifiability, and I'm thinking, why does the falsification, the ability to falsify a belief, or the inability to falsify a belief, entail that you only hold it because you want to hold it? I mean, this seems to be a non sequitur.
That's not what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is that it is a fact. So my assertion would be that your assertion, your argument is only an assumption, and I would hold that to be a fact because you don't have a proper foundation or any proof for your argument.
Apostate.
But I would say it is merely my opinion that you believe that because you want to believe in that. That's only
Do you
an
mind if I
opinion.
jump in real quick and just I want to get some clarification from you, buddy. What do you mean by assumption? You've said that a few times. Your argument is only an assumption. What do you mean by assumption?
Well, by assumption, I mean that, for example, Randall wants to. Sorry, I will not say wants to. I know that goes into a different direction. Randall asserts that God connects with certain people, is his argument, from a hidden state. And he makes that argument without presenting any evidence for it, which is why I would say that this is merely an assumption. I see where the word assumption creates a conflict. Maybe I'm just misusing it. Sorry for that.
But it sounds like what you're saying is when someone makes a claim and they don't have any evidence for that claim, or they don't provide any additional evidence other than the claim itself, then they're making an assumption. And so basically every claim has got to have something that is beneath it supporting it.
Yeah. Every claim should be based on proper reasoning, evidence. If there is a complete lack of that, if you are simply making a claim without any evidence, then that would be, to me, an assumption. Yeah.
Okay, so just a claim. Okay, I think that provides some clarity. Maybe I don't know. I'm going to pass it back over to Randall. I'm just going to say this. I've got like 1,000 thoughts on the conversation so far, and I would love to jump in and join in, but I'm just going to let you guys go and continue the conversation. So hopefully, I just wanted to jump in and maybe provide a little bit of clarity. I think that's kind of what's happening, is that Apostate's just saying that, like, that's just something that you said that you didn't really back up or defend adequately, and so you've got to do that in order for it to be a good rebuttal to something else I said. Anyways, Randall, take it away.
Yeah, I think at the beginning I did say, well, I mean, I'm a Christian and I've got all these other grounds to be a Christian. So I do have evidential grounds, reasons to believe there is a God, reasons to believe God raised Jesus from the dead, etc. And so that's all part of it. And then I said heaven is the new heavens and new earth, eternity, posthumous judgment. That's all part of the package. So those are entailments of this broader commitment to Christian belief. So don't say I don't have any evidence. You could say you may not like the evidence, or you say maybe you haven't looked at all the evidence I presented in my past work. But yeah, I presented evidence. Now, in terms of if you want to make specific claims, right? Like, well, why should we believe human beings have a spiritual essence called the soul? Well, then make a claim. If you want to make a claim, I think that hell is unjust. Well, then present an argument against the justice of hell. But I think if we're simply at the point of you expressing a general incredulity toward my beliefs and sort of sweeping aside the rebuttals I provide to divine hiddenness, sweeping aside the arguments that I've noted I have appealed to in the past for the truth of Christianity, well, then we're just sort of going to be stuck in neutral. So do you have actual arguments or grounds
what I'm doing
to
here
be
is that
skeptical of Christian claims of the afterlife?
well, the issue here is the topic of the afterlife. The afterlife is an established belief that that people who believe in the afterlife defend. I am somebody who firmly rejects that based on a lot of skepticism. I am not here to. I mean, you are you. I speak of you collectively. People who believe are making this claim of and are claiming that a certain thing exists and that it is logical, that it is that it makes sense. I am merely here to challenge that belief entirely. So it is completely normal for me to ask questions about the holes in the foundation of the narrative of this afterlife. So if I raise a problem about a certain aspect of this, like the hiddenness of God, or the problem that God excluding people, or not spreading his message everywhere in the world, then these are problems that must be addressed. When you now respond to these problems with specific arguments, such as that God connects to certain people, in from hiding, then that is a specific argument for which I would require some reasoning or some evidence that I cannot simply brush over and move away from, because that is a serious problem. I think the fact that God is supposedly hidden or not universal is a huge problem when it comes to the afterlife and when it comes to justice of God.
I want to jump in and allow Randal to respond to that. Like what, because you made that claim earlier about that was kind of your response to the argument from Hiddenness. So what reason do you have behind that?
So, I mean, a couple of things I've already shared. One very important was in Romans 2:12-15. Paul there compares Jews and Gentiles. Says the Gentile didn't have access to the law. And so to the extent that they didn't, they're not held responsible for the content of the law, the details for which they failed to observe. But the Jew who has the law is held to that higher standard because they've had access to the law. The general principle that you can extract there is that in the justice and mercy of God, God judges every person relative to the light that they've been given. If a person is never exposed to a clear understanding of the gospel, God presumably interacts with them differently than a person who was the head professor of a seminary. If a person has a limited cognitive function, then God interacts with them differently. If they are an infant or a small child, God interacts with them differently than if they're an adult with no cognitive difficulties. So that God always accommodates himself to the individual and understands perfectly where they're at, and then judges them relative to that light. And so then in terms of the point of divine hiddenness, I made two claims. So one general claim is that your evidential burden is to show that God doesn't have morally sufficient reasons to withhold some degree of his revelation to certain individuals at a certain time. And you hadn't provided any reason why that wouldn't be the case. The other thing that I pointed out is that we do have a model. And I gave the example of a mother and an infant, where the infant lacks cognitive awareness of the mother and yet can be in profound and intimate relationship with the mother. And then I extrapolated that, and I gave a specific example of a person who begins to live in accord with a moral law in their hearts, which they call the Platonic good because of their framework, and they do actually strive to love God or to love neighbor as themselves. And I said, already at that point, that person could be, through their beliefs and their practices in their life, moving into what Jesus describes in Matthew 25, verses 31-46. Because there he describes people who will say, Lord, Lord, when did we do all these things? And he will say, as much as you did to the least of these, my brothers, you did it unto me. And so I think that comports well as a model with that. So one of the reasons God is hidden, you could say, well, he's already revealing himself to those people, but they just don't fully understand that yet. Seems to me those are all reasonable responses.
I don't think that's really a response. I don't think that's really a sufficient response to the question at hand. I mean, the response given from Paul's statements about the Gentiles and the Jews is I can't really connect that to the hiddenness. I can only connect that to different cultures and different beliefs. We don't really have a proper response to why believing in God is such a challenge instead of God simply showing Himself to everybody. It's simply I mean we don't have a proper response to that. We are again simply making certain claims, certain assumptions about that. Now, when you expect me to present a counterproof, when you expect me to present an argument or evidence that this whole concept of hiddenness is unfair, that makes God unfair, then I don't understand why I'm supposed to present evidence to that. What I'm simply doing is to ask questions about your positive beliefs and to challenge the consistencies of those beliefs. But we will be.
How are my beliefs inconsistent? You've raised consistency. How are my beliefs at all inconsistent?
Well, let me ask you a question. Think about me. I was born into a Muslim family. I let go of that belief. I explored different beliefs. I looked into Christianity, concluded that I don't believe in God, that God does not exist. I understand that you are not entirely comfortable in making assumptions about how God will judge things. But if I, for example, today died as somebody who firmly rejects the belief in God and the afterlife, what would possibly happen to me according to your beliefs?
So there's several things here. I don't opine on where people are going to spend eternity. here's one of the things that we want to keep in mind, okay? So one of the underlying bases for the kind of skepticism I think you express is that God is going to be unjust in his judgment. So like Bertrand Russell famously saying, if it was shown that God does exist, what would you say? Oh, not enough evidence, God. The issue is, however, that when we talk about God, remember I talked at the beginning about, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in. The God I believe in is a God who's maximally just and merciful and good and wants the full number of people to be reconciled to him possible. There could be all sorts of people who have various obstacles in their life that keep them away from God. And some of them are non-culpable obstacles that those people experience. So for example, there was a woman, I was reading through some of the reports of people who had been sexually abused by Catholic priests in the Boston area. It was from the district attorney's report several years ago. And one of them was, she said, every time I hear the word Father, like Heavenly Father, I think of him, of this man that raped her. So you got to ask, in the case of a person like that, what sort of obstacles does she have to relate to God? I can't imagine. I can't imagine what that would do. If the clergy that you respected and looked up to and loved and so on abused you in that way, then what would that do to your relationship? What I do know is this, that whether in this life or in the next, God will meet every person in such a way that they can fully understand who he is and they can make a decision informed. And if they are truly unable to make a decision now, then there is a tradition in Christian theology that talks about a second chance, where they fully have an opportunity to understand. So I can't psychologize you, and I'm not about to. I don't know all of your story, and I don't know what issues you may have. What I do know is that God is fully just and merciful.
Well, but what I see here, Randall, I'm very sorry. What I simply think about all of this, when I think about the Christian argument, and to a different extent the Muslim argument is a little bit different from the Christian argument. But what I see with the Christian argument is that it is entirely insufficient. It is simply not satisfying. When I think about myself, okay, I understand that you don't want to make assumptions and judgments about my life and afterlife, but what I see is that I, for example, was born into a Muslim family. I grew up really questioning and thinking about thinking about belief, about God and all that. I explored, I truly wanted to believe that there is some great justice in the world, that there is some creator that I will return to, that I will be judged in this and that. But I ended up being entirely unconvinced with the idea of God. Now, for the sake of the argument, it is entirely irrelevant why I am unconvinced, because there will be millions of people out there who are also unconvinced for completely different reasons. Whether I am now convinced today or not plays no role in this. There will be millions of people who are unconvinced and who therefore will die with a disbelief in God. Now, when those people die with a disbelief in God, the Christian belief is usually that those people will die as disbelievers, especially if they were confronted with the Christian belief and rejected the Christian belief and disbelieved in the Christian belief. They will die as non-Christians, as disbelievers, as people who rejected Christ. And those people will be punished in different ways, punished with eternal torment, punished with eternal separation, punished with annihilation. But where is the justice in that? I did not reject God because I thought, well, God exists, but I don't really want to believe in God. I don't really care. I rather want to go to this place where I will be tortured forever, or I will rather want to be annihilated. No, I did not believe in God because I was not convinced that God exists. And looking at that, I simply see that there is a moral inconsistency in Christianity, in the claim that God wants everyone to be saved and God wants goodness, but he seemingly judges humans based on whether they were convinced of God or not. Now, there is the argument that you made that people will be given a second chance after they die, and they will be again confronted with the idea of God and will be again given the chance to believe in God. But if that is so, then what is the point of this temporary life? If that is so, what is the point of death? If that is so, what is the point of any of that? God could have simply just revealed himself from the very beginning. If people see in this second chance that God does indeed exist, then nobody will willingly want to go to hell. Nobody will willingly want to be punished. Everybody will acknowledge, oh, so you do exist. Okay, I believe in you. If belief is enough, then everybody will be believed. Everybody will believe in the second chance anyway. anyway? What is the point of any of this? There is no justice, no reasoning to this. I don't understand.
Well, you got to get Christian beliefs right to begin with. You keep describing it simply as a matter of belief, as its cognitive assent to a set of propositions. That's not saving relationship with God and Jesus Christ. As James said, faith without works is dead. I've referred to Matthew 25:31-46, and there Jesus doesn't say, the way you tell sheep apart from goats is that the sheep are the ones who believed in this set of propositions. Rather, the sheep are those who undertook these works. And it's not that you're saved by works, it's rather that the works that you do in terms of loving your neighbor, those vulnerable on the margins, that is indicative of what saving relationship with God and Jesus Christ looks like. I like to give people the following contrast. Okay, so during the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, I want to talk about two different responses to that. So one of them was from a Seventh-day Adventist pastor who was Hutu, which is part of the ethnic group that was carrying out the genocide. His name is Elizabeth Nkutarama. And he was actually called to the Muganero complex where some of his Tutsi congregants were hiding. They were asking him for help. He goes out there and he brings along the Hutu militias so that the people can be massacred and they're all slaughtered. So he's complicit in crimes against humanity. On the other hand, you have Mabaye Diagne, who was a Muslim, and he was working with United Nations peacekeeping forces in Rwanda at the same time. Every day, he defied the orders of Romeo Dallaire, who was head of the UN peacekeeping forces, to stay within the compound, and he went out without a weapon and driving his Jeep, filled his Jeep up with Tutsis, and then bargained across Hutu checkpoints with cigarettes and jokes in order to get them back into what was called Hotel Rwanda and to save lives. After about 3 weeks, he was blown up in shrapnel. And I say to people, and I say to Christians, if you have the choice to go before the throne of God with the life and legacy of Nkutarama, the Christian who was complicit in genocide, or you have the opportunity to go before the throne of God as Mabaye Diagne, the Muslim who loved his neighbor as himself, which do you choose? If those are your only options, which do you choose? And what I'm doing there is I'm contrasting what you can call orthodoxy, getting all the right beliefs, or orthopraxy, living rightly. And I've never had anybody say that they would choose to be the Orthodox guy who was complicit in genocide. What this says to me is it doesn't say that you're saved by works. What it says to me is the heart of Christian belief is not checking a bunch of doctrinal boxes. It's living as Jesus calls us to live. Those are his disciples. So if you want to begin by talking about the justice of the Christian account of reality, you have to begin by getting it right. It's not simply mental assent to some arbitrary set of doctrines. It's being in right relationship with God through Jesus, which is expressed through acts of love for one's neighbor.
This is a minority belief, however, right? I mean, it is a very Christian teaching that even people who have done a lot of sins, misdeeds, will be saved because they believed in Jesus and prayed to him. And this is a majority belief among Protestants, among Catholics, among Orthodox, added with deeds. But the idea, seemingly, that people could be saved without belief simply based on their actions is a minority belief, if that's what you are implying.
I've not said they're saved by their actions. I did say inclusivism is a position that has existed throughout the history of the church. The Catholic Church has endorsed inclusivism explicitly since Vatican II. They've actually referred to what they call anonymous Christians, which are people in various other cultural and religious contexts, many of which have never heard of Christianity, but nonetheless may find themselves to be in a salvific relationship with God and Jesus Christ, and they never even knew it.
I don't understand how that relates to my question, however. I mean, I don't understand how that relates to my argument, because we're giving very extreme examples of people who have done very horrible things or very good things despite their beliefs. But my entire point was about me, for example, or an average person who dies without believing in the truth, who just lives his life, does whatever he wants, and just dies as a regular person, and then is judged in the afterlife and is seemingly judged based on their belief. I mean, if we're thinking about me, are you arguing that I could just live my life as I wish without ever caring about Christianity as I am now, and I could simply go to heaven in the afterlife? Is that a possibility in your in your theological perspective?
Like Ulrich Zwingli in the 16th century, one of the founders of the Protestant Reformation, he talks about Hercules in heaven, for example. Now, this going back to the 2nd century, people like Justin Martyr, they talked about people like Plato, the great Greek philosopher who existed 400 years before Jesus, as being in a saving relationship with God, and that you would see them again in eternity. So this idea of a sort of a generosity of God's grace, a wideness of his mercy, an inclusiveness of salvation. Not only, I think, do you find reason for that in places like Matthew 25, where you have this upsetting of the expectations of salvation in terms of the sheep and the goats, but you also find it represented through people like Justin Martyr on down to the Catholic Church today, and inclusivists like evangelicals John Sander or Clark Pinnock or many others, and certainly myself included. I'd be a hopeful inclusivist. So my simple point is that don't reject Christianity simpliciter, mere Christianity that I've been defending here, by identifying what you think are some problems with some particular reductionistic construal of Christianity that says in order to be saved, you have to check certain doctrinal boxes in this life, because I think those are really straw men. What you want to do is you want to go for the broader sweep of the Christian tradition, and that's what I presented here.
Who then would be not? I really want to inquire about your certain beliefs. I mean, I assume that you have firm beliefs, foundations about the doctrine of the afterlife. I mean, what kind of a person, what qualities would make somebody not be saved?
Well,
that's
something every Christian has to ask themselves. I think one of the issues that concerns me sometimes in these discussions is when Christians talk about the doctrine of hell, they're thinking in their minds about all those people outside of our church or outside of the church. And of course, as I said with the sheep and the goats, Jesus actually marginalizes that kind of conviction and certainty. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 13:5, test yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. So he's reminding us, encouraging us to continue. You need to continue to introspect yourself, because the human heart is deceitful. We're almost all afflicted by something called an optimism bias. And an optimism bias says that we tend to view ourselves more favorably than the evidence warrants. And so when people say, when the atheist or non-Christian says, hey, I'm just purely rational and I reject God just because of pure rationality and I weighed the evidence and that, I'd say maybe check your optimism bias and maybe your confirmation bias, and maybe there's something more going on there. But that also reflects on me. If I want to be really confident that I'm on the in with God and everyone else is on the outs, maybe I need to check my optimism bias and my confirmation bias as well. So I think we all need a little bit of epistemic humility in these conversations.
But what I see here, Randal, is that anybody could. I mean, think about a Buddhist community, for example. Buddhists are people that I have been recently quite looking into and researching and exchanging information with, and they seem to follow a very good moral code that works very well for them. They don't engage in any activities and any acts that would be considered evil from a Christian perspective, for example, and they simply live their lives as good, devout Buddhists and die. They could simply live that life and die. They don't need Christianity, as far as I can understand this, because belief is not necessary for salvation eventually. Deeds could be possibly enough, as far as I see this. I mean, I don't understand where we are standing on what the afterlife actually is for, what purpose it serves. I could live my entire life as a Buddhist in a Buddhist community in Nepal or in Tibet or wherever it is, and die, and I would be just fine. Or some other completely moral Taoist community could live their lives in a very good life and die. They would be just fine. So why do we have a need for Christianity then?
Well, we have a need for it because I think it's true. So Christianity is not simply a pragmatic
But it
tool
doesn't
to live
serve
a
a
good life.
purpose. I mean, you don't need it for salvation, as far as I see. You don't need it to live a good life. So, what is the purpose of it? We're discussing the afterlife, but you were basically arguing that everyone could go
But
to.
that's just a pure pragmatism. It's like you're saying, well, why should I bother being a Christian if I don't necessarily have to have become a Christian convert in order to be saved by Jesus ultimately? The issue is that Christianity is true. And of course, I mean, the inclusivist could be wrong. The exclusivist who says you do have to have a certain degree of cognitive awareness of Jesus in order to be saved by him, they could be correct, because Christianity, mere Christianity, doesn't actually take a position on those kinds of issues. That's getting a little bit into the theological weeds. But I think that we're kind of going back and forth here on inclusivism and not so much on the afterlife itself. So I'd first of all maybe like to hear from you. How do you define a life well lived? What is a good life, and why do you believe that?
Well, if we want to go there, sure. I mean, I live a life that is not surrounded by a God. I create a family. I don't have to. That's what I choose to. I create a family. I have children. I teach them to be functional, to be good to others, to live healthy, to do something with their lives, to do what they want, establish things, leave something for the future, be happy, healthy. I mean, we have a very limited lifetime, and I see that past lifetimes that went good, that were productive, that taught us good things, give us good beneficial things today in our time. I don't feel a need to work toward an afterlife. It rather seems a little bit absurd that I would engage in that.
Like, so where do you get your values from? You know, the values that you seek to instill within your children as to what a life well lived is. Where do those values come from? Are they just things you subjectively you like them, or do you have some deeper basis to want to instill this set of values in your children, or rather than another?
Well, many of them are based on, we have a history of millennia of philosophy, of people trying to find out what the best way to live is. People have made different assertions. A very dominant one is that people have this ultimate desire to flourish, to be happy, and that we as social animals, social beings, desire to flourish, and that we can increase this flourishing by being good to each other. When I now go outside and I see my children go to school, what I see is that if my child is nice to people, if he's kind to people, then they will be kind to him. If my child, on the other hand, goes and starts beating up people or starts stabbing people, they will beat up him and stab him. And in the end, he will not be happy. The others will not be happy. It will just end in chaos. What I see is a sense of functionalism and utilitarianism. If we are good to each other, if we help each other and maximize utility, then we will eventually all be a little bit happier. And we find different ways to maximize utility and to decrease harm.
Okay, so in your view, a life well lived is simply a life that has maximized happiness for the individual, and a society that is a good society is simply a society that has maximized happiness for the society.
I wouldn't say happiness. I think happiness is a word that is not really well defined in English. But
you were using that word, so I was wondering.
Yeah, I know.
Would you put something else in then?
Eudaimonia in the Greek philosophy, for example, hits it much better. Human flourishing. I would say flourishing is a purpose that is yeah.
See, it seems to like this is one of the big differences. So what I sought to explain at the beginning is Christianity is a fundamentally teleological worldview. It's a worldview where we have particular ends as individuals and collectively as a society, and history itself is going in a particular direction. And your flourishing is defined relative to the ends for which you were created and living in accord and alignment with those ends. In terms of eudaimonia, invoking a concept like that, what is the teleological framework by which you are defining flourishing beyond simply a sort of lowbrow appeal to pleasure or happiness?
I mean, as I said, it is based on the idea has developed over the last centuries in terms of utilitarianism, for example, in with which I do not completely agree when it comes to its classical foundations, but I agree that it is very logical. Humans have we also recently find out in neuroscience and in psychology that all humans have the will to live, and all humans eventually seek to live a satisfying, happy life. And I mean, it is merely logical. You want to flourish, you want to feel safe, you want to be happy. Things that are contrary to that will make you feel unsafe, will make you feel hurt, will make you feel harmed. It will eventually be counterproductive and destructive to humankind. What seems to be appropriate is to work toward a better future, a more functional future, a more productive future, a more overall happy future. I don't see what kind of nature we are looking for in that.
So I don't want to get you off of your train of thought here, Randal, but I did just want to say really quickly, we're about 15 minutes away from switching to Q&A. So just keep that in mind as we go through the next 15-minute section, that we are going to be transitioning at some point to Q&A. So,
I really want to see where we're getting at with this.
Yeah. So one last thing. So if you have a question for either of my guests today, Apostate Prophet or Randal Rauser, then let me know in the live chat. You can send it as a super chat. We're going to get through the super chats first before we start taking other questions. So, and we've already got about 4 or 5 in the queue, super chats. Thank you guys for sending those, by the way. And so we're going to get to those. We're going to move to Q&A in just about 15 minutes here. So yeah, just wanted to let you guys know. All right.
So just it did seem to me that happiness and utilitarianism was sort of again what you appealed to, and it seems certainly from my perspective. So again, like the afterlife is not simply something tagged on to this life. I said at the end, what you do in this life echoes into eternity. That this it's all part of a package for a Christian worldview. We are creatures that are designed to live in a particular way. And our flourishing, our eudaimonia, is not simply happiness, it's something more. In fact, you can undertake decisions and make choices that are precisely contrary to your happiness. Like when Dietrich Bonhoeffer left Germany right before World War II to seek asylum in the United States. And then after just a few weeks in New York, he said, you know what, I need to return and be in solidarity with my people. He ended up getting hanged in 1945 at Flossenburg camp. Well, on the one hand, he made choices that deliberately undermine his happiness. But I think, in fact, that is precisely the heart of the Christian life, of discipleship, of taking up your cross daily and following Jesus, engaging in acts of self-abnegation or self-denial as you seek to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's what informs the Christian understanding of reality. So it seems to me that the air is a little bit thin metaphysically and ethically in your worldview if you're only appealing to a sort of lowbrow utilitarian calculation of maximizing pleasure or happiness in individuals and a collective society.
On the contrary, I think that that my perspective is very much based on observations and on functionality, and what works, to say it very crudely. Whereas when I look at the doctrine of an afterlife, I simply see that it is again, I will say it, I'm sorry, but based on assumptions. Because as said, my way to live and my perspective, which shows me that this is a good way to live, is based on observations, based on logic, based on functionalism, based on human satisfaction and this and that. Whereas working for the afterlife, for example, or working your life in a certain way, according to a certain belief, because there is an afterlife, is seemingly merely a life based on myths, based on mythology, based on assumptions that is built on very loose foundations, that has evidential basis like a resurrection, which is not a convincing argument to people, and an afterlife that also seems very unconvincing and also seems to be very, very much based on assumptions, on myths, which kind of demands counter arguments, but it doesn't have proper arguments itself.
Okay, so you said again a few times, based on myths, based on assumptions. It seems to me that No, but it seems to me that you have an assumption that it's based on a myth, right? I think that you have your own assumptions. In fact, everybody has assumptions, presuppositions,
Of course,
starting
yeah.
points of reasoning, a background framework from which they reason. We all have that. And it seems to me that you've repeatedly assumed that my views are, it seems to me you're using the word myth as false rather than the technical sense as to what myth means. And so you're just saying, well, your beliefs are just myth, they're just false. And why are they false? Well, you just, again, you reiterated because I don't like your argument for the resurrection. I don't know that you've actually looked at my argument or not, but regardless, I've already rebutted that by saying arguments don't have to be universally compelling in order to be good arguments. So you don't have to have that highest standard of proof in order for the argument to be good. So that's not a basis of itself to reject the argument. Hey,
The
can
issue
we?
is
Yeah,
the issue is I don't see the point. I mean, we are discussing the afterlife and whether it makes sense to believe in it or not, for example. I simply don't see why we would possibly believe in the concept, in the idea, in the existence of an afterlife. As far as I can see, there is no reason to believe in that. We have arguments to reaffirm the faith in an afterlife, but we have no reasoning based on why we should actually believe in that, based on why it should exist or why it makes sense.
We're about to switch to Q&A, but I did want to ask, because I saw this in the live chat earlier, and maybe it'll help us move the conversation along in the last 10 minutes before we move to Q&A. Someone suggested near-death experiences. Someone said something along the lines of, do near-death experiences provide any evidence for the afterlife? So why don't we talk about that for the next 10 minutes, and then we can move to Q&A. Randal, I don't know if this is something that you've done any work on, or I mean, if it's not something that
a
you've
little
looked.
bit. So,
Okay.
Yeah, no. So of course, near-death experiences are evidence for the afterlife in terms of being evidence for a dualist account of the person. So the idea that there is a non-physical part of the person that can exist apart from the physical. At least that is certainly the implication of a particular subset of near-death experiences called out-of-body experience. So is there evidence that people have out-of-body experiences? Well, there's some very interesting evidence. Some of these case studies have been studied in leading medical journals like the Lancet and the British Medical Journal. Pim van Lommel is the well-known example of a Dutch, I think he's a neurologist who's written on and studied these. Michael Sabom is a Christian who wrote 2 books on out-of-body experiences. So these are examples where people have experiences near death, and then they come back and they provide veridical evidence that they were in fact apart from their body, such as having knowledge of something that was going on in the room next to the OR where they were being operated on, things like that. And so that is quite interesting evidence for an afterlife. There is also near-death experiences more generally, where there's a certain universal experience that many people have in terms of when they're near death, a light at the end of a tunnel, life review, often a sense that there is a benevolent presence there, there's love. Sometimes they see loved ones that have gone on. Jeffrey Long wrote a book called Evidence of the Afterlife, and on his website, where he's gathered together globally thousands of examples of these from different religious traditions. So this is not evidence simply limited to Christianity. And how you theologically interpret all of that evidence is another question. But I think that there is good evidence from stuff like out-of-body experiences that dualism, metaphysical substance dualism of some kind, is correct, and the human beings are not simply physical organisms, but in fact we do have a non-physical component, which you can call a mind or a soul.
Are you done? Yeah. So I looked into near-death experiences before, also at out-of-body experiences in general. What I've seen was it was actually one thing that kind of bugged me when I was losing my faith in a god. It really bothered me. I wanted to look into it further. And what I've seen then, what I've also seen over the last few years, I am studying psychology. I have studied quite a bit of neuroscience. Is that the neuroscientific studies, the research that we have on near-death experiences are pretty much inconclusive when it comes to providing proof that there is actually something out of body going on in a near-death experience. If there was any such thing, it would create much more. It would create a much larger impact. What I see from scientific observations so far is that a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience is interpreted as simply having to do with basic functions of a brain, of a sleeping brain, of a sleeping mind, of a mind that is that is functioning under completely different standards of a person who wakes up from a coma or from a state and then is confused about things. We don't actually have any evidence of people reporting anything extraordinary, like seeing real things that are going on outside. I am really interested, and I am really looking into something that is evidence, that is convincing, but I could not personally see anything that is convincing in that regard. And even if we did see, let me say this, even if we did, which we do not, even if we did eventually find out that some people have experiences where they are in a coma and then they can see their surroundings and things that really happen, that would not be an evidence of an afterlife. That would simply be, that could be some supporting evidence that there is more to us than just our physical perceptions. But that would be all. That would be it.
Well, you certainly could believe in an afterlife and be a materialist. You could believe, as many Christians do, that in fact we are just material beings. We cease to exist as when we die, and then we are resurrected at the general resurrection. So that's certainly a minority view, but you could hold that view. But I do think that these are interesting cases. So I just pulled up one of them. So this is Pim van Lommel, Near-Death Experience in Survivors of Cardiac Arrest, a prospective study in the Netherlands that was published in The Lancet, one of the leading medical journals in the world, in December 2001. So he's also written a book on this topic. I mentioned Michael Sabom and others. So I think a lot of that material is quite suggestive. I wrote an article some years ago about sprites, and I was talking about it in analogy with near-death experiences. So what a sprite is, in the 1970s, pilots that were flying at like 35,000 feet, commercial airline pilots, would describe seeing these strange flashes going up from clouds into the stratosphere. And they were initially dismissed. So there's no evidence for such events as that. And then eventually, those anecdotes were supported by meteorological studies that established there are these things now fancifully called sprites, which are essentially like lightning bursts that don't go down to the ground, but rather go up into the stratosphere or the troposphere. And they were being observed by these pilots flying. And I think in some ways that you can look at the evidence that we now have for the afterlife in terms of out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences as analogous to those sprites. So we don't yet have categories for some of these things, but there is suggestive evidence. Now, Apostate Prophet, you did refer again to proof and say, well, that doesn't meet a particular standard of proof. And it's a common theme that I've heard here. But again, you don't have to have universally compelling proof. In fact, science, certainly science on the edge in things like neurology, you rarely are getting into things like proof. You're often have various weights of evidence for interpreting otherwise ambiguous evidence. But there's some evidence.
Well, the question was whether a near-death experiences could be seen as proof for the afterlife. So that is simply what I'm commenting on. It wasn't my thing. That was the question, as far as I remember, Cameron. That's why I responded that way. But again, I wouldn't see. I mean, near-death experiences are something that are largely unverifiable, largely person dependent, very similar to personal experiences, what we call personal experiences in theological discussions, which I think are very unhelpful. It would just, again, make me ask the question, why is it so difficult? Why does it have to be so personal? Why does it have to be instance dependent? Why is the afterlife, why is God not simple? If our purpose is to believe, if our purpose is to go to this afterlife and to be saved, why is it not simple? It would just go back to that. I don't know if we want to go back to that. I think we're at the end of this.
Well, maybe I got a minute or two here. So you mentioned personal experience. So here's something to keep in mind, that in fact, personal experience can be enormously powerful veridically for the individual who has that experience. So to give you one example, let's say that I have memory of having been home working in the backyard yesterday, but nobody was around, but I have clear memory of that. And then the police come to my door today and they accuse me of being involved in a murder. And they provide evidence when I'm interrogated that there are two people who say they saw me at the murder yesterday morning. and there's grainy surveillance footage showing a vehicle arriving at the scene which looks like my vehicle, and I have a motive. So the detective, the prosecutor, they may believe based upon that objective evidence that I am in fact the murderer, but I, based upon my very powerful experience of remembering that I was working in the backyard yesterday, may also be equally justified, if not more so, in believing I am indeed innocent and unjustly accused. So we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the powerful evidential value of experience, even if there is evidence available to others who haven't had the experience, which appears to confirm it.
I would say that that is a very suspicious case, and would, in modern medical terms, sound like it is a personal. It is a mental disorder or a mental problem that results from a disconnection of your identity, of derealization, or of a multiple personality disorder or similar mental.
Well, what are we
disorders, for
referring?
example.
We're not referring to
I mean,
my
if-
memory of being in the backyard. Are you?
Being in the backyard when there is overwhelming evidence that you did something else at the same time. So
But I didn't say it was overwhelming evidence. I said two
You said
people
there was
said
some
they saw
evidence,
me
right?
there. I said that there's a grainy surveillance footage and there's a motive. That is certainly defeasible evidence.
I don't know how that was how that would. I mean, that would, okay, personally it would probably serve as good evidence to believe in something, but I would say it wouldn't.
I mean, really,
it
if you
could serve as
remembered,
purpose to believe in very bad things too.
you were certain, that you have this clear memory that you were gardening yesterday, and then people say, "Hey, but these two guys say that you did this murder, and we have grainy surveillance footage of your car or something that looks like your car, and we have a motive." Would you really change your belief and say, "Oh, I
Well,
guess I did murder that person"?
Well, I mean, it is personally convincing, but that is the problem. It is only personally convincing. I mean, we
That's
have
all I'm saying.
nowadays
That's all I'm saying
we
here.
have nowadays
In terms of,
official
yeah.
medical terms under which we have a mental disorder where people have different personalities that they change to and from time to time, where they feel like a different person at one time and feel like a different person at another time, and
Okay.
have a mental
Yeah,
fugue where they go into different states. So this is
I think Occam's razor would help us here, that unless there's some independent reason that I have some sort of dissociative personality disorder, that I would continue to be justified in believing I was in fact in the backyard gardening.
Well, the issue is it would only convince yourself. That would be, again, not really
Yeah, I didn't say
helpful.
otherwise, but I did say that personal experience can be compelling to that person, and that person is not rationally justified in revising their beliefs simply because other people have evidence available to them that appears to disconfirm it. That's all.
Okay.
Okay, I think this is a good time for us to switch to Q&A. So we've already, like I said, we've had a few come in, and one of them we've already talked about, which was how relevant are near-death experiences here. And so we've talked about near-death experiences for the last 10 minutes or so. So thank you for sending in that super chat, and that's the one that actually spawned my wanting to talk about it. So here's another super chat that was sent in by the same person. And I don't know if they were asking a question or maybe if they just want some clarification, the difference between rebutting and undercutting defeaters. Randall, I'm sure that you're familiar with that distinction, so maybe just lay it out really quickly. And while you're doing that, my computer was sent off to get serviced. I just got it back, and so I had to reset up all of my different apps and everything. So while you're talking, I'm going to go in and try to format this comment to make it look more like my branding and stuff. I could only do it when we were actually live and comments were coming in. So hopefully you can talk long enough to allow me to to do this. Well, anyways, go ahead and tell us about that distinction, and maybe I don't know exactly what part of the conversation it came up in. But I'm sure it's relevant somewhere.
I'll try to tie it in. So a rebutting defeater is evidence directly against the truth of the claim, whereas an undercutting defeater undermines your grounds to think the claim is true without specifically showing it is true. So one of the standard examples that is given for an undercutting defeater is if you are in a room and then you see that in fact all of the widgets in the room that are being assembled are red widgets, but then you learn that in fact the room is illuminated by red light, then that undercuts your basis to think the widgets are in fact red, because they could in fact be another color and they would still look red because of the lighting. What that doesn't show is that the widgets are in fact other than red. So it doesn't provide you the basis in the undercutting case to believe the claim is false, but it does undercut your basis to think the claim is true. Now, one place where you could tie this in would be like this. if Apostate Prophet says, your belief in an afterlife is the result of wish fulfillment, well, that doesn't show that it is false. But if my belief is in fact if it is in fact generated by wish fulfillment, and wish fulfillment doesn't reliably track to the truth, then that would undercut my basis to believe my views of the afterlife are in fact true, without showing that they're false. So in other words, it's a weaker kind of argument to argue that my beliefs are the result of wish fulfillment. Doesn't show that they're false, but does undercut my basis to believe they're true.
Yeah, so when you present an argument for the afterlife, and I then say, well, this argument has a flaw in it because of this and this and that, but I don't present any proof or any argument that is supposed to, that an afterlife does not exist. I simply have a problem with certain parts of your logic. Then I would be undercutting. Right, instead of just rebutting it. You were basically asking for me to rebut your entire belief.
Well, but I was rebutting your undercutting defeater. So I was showing you haven't. First of all, I said the hallmarks of my belief have certain aspects that are not indicative of wish fulfillment, such as the belief in posthumous judgment, which nobody likes, and also the belief in the indeterminacy of the elect. Because I said, hey, Christians aren't even sure that we're in. Right? There's this thing about the sheep and the goats. Mm-hmm. That is not what you would expect if the belief was the product of wish fulfillment. So that is evidence rebutting your claim of wish fulfillment.
I really didn't want my assertion that this is simply wishful thinking to be received as a proper argument that I expect to be proven wrong on. I mean, that was just it is simply a remark. I think it is simply a remark because I think you're making an argument that is baseless, that is seemingly an assumption to me, and I think that you're making it because of wishful thinking. Maybe I could leave the wishful thinking out so that we can focus on whether the argument is true or not. I could have just phrased that better.
All right, I've got another super chat here from Brute Facts Podcast, and he says very kindly, this is from a guy named Eddie Kroom, who's actually a supporter of our ministry. He says, Capturing Christianity is a top-notch quality ministry. Thank you, Cameron, for the quality content. Thank you for your super chat. Thank you for your support. That means a lot. And yeah, I love to do what I do, and I love to bring conversations to YouTube like the ones that we're doing today. So thank you for your support. It means a lot. If you guys want to support this ministry, head over to our Patreon. It's also linked in the description of this video. And we actually do need some more support because we've brought my wife Brittany on board to plan all of our events. We've got a conference coming up in August. You can actually attend the conference that we have going on just by visiting our website, capturingchristianity.com. We just have a ton of things going on, and so we do need your financial support in order to make all of this happen. So thank you for doing that if you're considering it. All right, so another super chat question from one of the same persons that we had earlier, and I'm not saying their name because it just looks too complicated and I don't want to get it wrong. He or she says, what are the positive reasons for God to maintain epistemic distance? This is related to the question of divine hiddenness that we discussed earlier on in the debate, if you want to call it that. Could it be related to the nature of moral choice and action? It's a very inquisitive question.
Yeah, so there's a famous statement from Pascal, which I can't quote here, where he says essentially that God reveals himself to a significant degree so that we can believe, but not to a sufficient degree that he compels belief. So it's he wants to give us sort of this space to enter into a free relationship rather than we find ourselves to be compelled to belief. And that's probably the kind of space that person is talking about there. I mean, I think that it's helpful to think in terms, now it's imperfect, but nonetheless to think in terms of the analogy of a parent to a child. So for example, let's say that a child runs away from the parent in the shopping mall. I think we've all had that experience when we have little kids. And then the kid suddenly realizes that the parent's not around, and they start calling out for the parent, and the parent hides behind a bush. Well, why would the parent do that if the child only wants to find the parent, and they even burst into tears, and the parent still lingers for about 10 more seconds before they appear? Well, the parent could have morally sufficient reasons. Here's one of them. Maybe the child is always kind of absent-mindedly wandering away, and by withholding themselves from the child for a moment in terms of epistemic distance, the parent now makes it more likely that the child will then remember this event and be less likely to wander away in the future. And so that would be a morally sufficient reason that the parent could have to withhold themselves. Now, what reasons could God have to withhold himself in various ways and from various people? Well, I think there, again, could be all sorts of things. Here's one more that I would just throw in there in relation to that. One thing that's very important in Christianity is that you're saved not simply as individuals, Lone Ranger Christians, rather you're saved into a Christian community. And one of the realities is that people, when they struggle with doubts in Christian community, is that they can be buoyed up and encouraged by others in the Christian community. And the doubts and questions they may have about God, those could be something that God allows them to experience to draw them further into that community and develop friendships and relationships with people within that community, and then grow through the adversity of the time of questioning until they finally return to belief.
Here's my problem that I have with that, Cameron. Is it okay if I just
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my problem with the whole thing is, if we want to get back to that quickly, the whole point that it is merely an assumption that God connects to some people or communicates with some people, in a hidden state, is I could, for example, say that. It is an absurd example, but I could speak of Odin, for example, which is who was the god, the allfather of the Scandinavian people, of the Nordic people, and he was known for providing wisdom, for providing great wisdom. And I could say, hey, so he doesn't show himself, but when you sit down and you have this great inspiration and this flow of knowledge and of wisdom going through your mind, and you suddenly find a lot of answers to all your questions. What is really happening there is that Odin is actually visiting you, and he is providing you with the wisdom that you need. But this is simply a claim that I'm making, and I could now support that with a piece of evidence that is also a Nordic text which says that this is possible. But then I wouldn't be actually providing any evidence. I would simply, using my own evidence to support my own evidence. It just doesn't work. It is merely a claim in the end. And to say that God connects to some people from a hidden state and that this somehow explains the hiddenness of God is also merely a claim, just like that one. It is only a claim. That's the problem.
Well, maybe I'll give a 10-second response. Is that okay?
Yeah, we've got some time. I wasn't jumping in because I figured that we could talk about it for a little bit. We do have some time, so maybe just another minute or two, and then we'll move on.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that is to keep in mind is that, like, you're sort of protesting here, yeah, but what evidences do you have for that particular claim that God is in fact doing that? And I think that that's misunderstanding what's going on here, is that you're the one providing, in terms of divine hiddenness, an alleged defeater, a rebutting defeater for theistic or Christian belief. That being that if Christian or theistic belief were true, we would not expect there to be any people who are non-resistant non-believers. And what I'm saying is, I don't actually agree, because here's a scenario in which there are non-resistant non-believers, and God has various morally sufficient reasons to allow that non-resistant non-belief to exist for a period of time. That then undercuts your defeater, because it shows that, in fact, so we go back to undercutting defeaters, it shows that, in fact, your defeater doesn't support atheism or non-theism, because it is consistent. What we find in terms of non-resistant non-believers is consistent with theism. So the point, in other words, is I'm not providing positive arguments to be a theist or a Christian at this point, but I am undercutting or rebutting your attempt to provide a defeater for Christian belief.
Well, I believe there is a great inconsistency in arguing in the fact that this whole belief in God and the afterlife comes with the idea, with the fact that this God is hidden. And he expects us to believe. Belief is a challenge. He expects us to believe, to follow him, to do certain things according to his own morals. But many of us, are simply left believing that we should believe, or that we should act in a specific way, without actually knowing whether that is true or not. Without knowing whether the thing that we are supposed to believe in actually is true or not, or whether the morals that we are supposed to follow are right or not. So we are only being compelled by Christians or others to believe or to follow certain morals, and then we are left to trust a chain of sources that tell us about this God and tell us about this afterlife. We don't actually have any evidence for that. We don't. God is hidden. He's not revealing himself to us. If God did reveal himself to us, then it would be easy for us. It would be a given for us to simply believe in him and to follow his morals in a certain way. But most people do not do that because they do not believe, because they are not convinced. And that is simply inconsistent. There is no reasoning behind this.
Okay, unfortunately, we do have to move on. So let's get to another question here. And this one is actually really interesting. It's going to take us in a completely different direction. This one is from Laurel Strobel. Thank you for your super chat. She says, for both, why is believing the truth important? This is something that's related to what Randal was talking about earlier. It's like, why, and you, Apostate Prophet, you were talking about, like, why is evangelism even important? Because if it's just like these people who aren't Christians can be saved, then what's the point of it? And then Randal, one of his responses was to say, well, it's because Christianity is true. So the question is, why is believing the truth important? If someone is happy and wrong, why is that bad? I think that's a really interesting question. Let's start with you, Apostate.
I would say it is not wrong to it is not wrong or bad to be wrong. If you are happy with being wrong. I certainly think that I am wrong about many things. I think that Muslims are wrong, Christians are wrong, Buddhists are wrong. So many people are wrong about their worldviews, about their theological ideas, their beliefs, and all that. But as long as they are happy, as long as they're not hurting anyone, as long as they're not destroying the world, there is not really much wrong with that. If false beliefs start causing harm and oppressing others, if they turn into tyranny, then that is bad. But I would personally say having false beliefs is not in and of itself wrong. I care personally about authenticity and about finding out what the truth is. That is just personally important to me, which is why I'm engaging in these discussions.
What about you, Randal?
Okay, so yeah. So on the first point I'd want to say is, I think it's clear that all things being equal, it is better to have a true belief than a false one. I think that truth is something that we recognize as intrinsically of value, just like we recognize the good being of value. So Thomas Aquinas says the first principle of ethics is good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. And if someone says, yeah, but why? I would simply say, hey, you're just not part of the conversation, because there comes a point where you have to sort of recognize intuitively that goodness is of intrinsic value, truth is of intrinsic value. Having said that, there are times where there is value in having a false belief. So for example, if I'm going to go to the Toastmasters Club and I'm about to give a speech there, and I think I'm the smartest and funniest guy in the room, but I'm not, nonetheless, that false belief buoys me up with confidence that allows me to deliver a better speech than I would have otherwise, then there could be some value in having a false belief in a context like that. There could also be cases where it's trivial that one has a false belief, and so maybe it's not worthwhile dealing with that. What is significant in this case, however, is that I think Christianity, if it's true, it's world-changing truth. It's maximally important existential and metaphysical and ethical truth. And that's why we should value it, not only because truth is intrinsically valuable, all things being equal, but because this is an important truth.
All right, let's move on to another question. We've only got about 15 minutes left, so we're going to try to breeze through a few more of these. Let me just quickly address this one. This one was sent in as a $10 super chat, so I felt like I needed to address it. Someone says, Tony Teb says, please get Jay Dyer on here. So this is completely off topic, but Jay Dyer, I'm not going to have him on my channel. He and I and Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones, we were scheduling a dialogue between the two of them, and things just went really south really quickly in a conversation with him that we had on Facebook and Facebook Messenger. So you can actually learn more about that if you go through some of the messages from a couple years ago at this point on Inspiring Philosophy's Facebook page. But that's the reason it was... I'm not going to have him on my channel and give him a platform. So let's move on to another question. This one is from... same person who's been sending these in, and again, I'm not going to try to do their name or pronounce their name, but can AP conceive a version of the afterlife that would make life here and now more meaningful if it were true?
It isn't.
I know it's a tough question. Yeah, it's a tough question. It's gonna require you to think up something off the off the top of your head, off the. So
it
yeah,
is.
I get
it is a very. It is a very yeah, it is a very
Very
weird question.
speculative.
But
Yeah.
it's a very interesting question though. Consider version
Right.
of afterlife that would make life here and now more meaningful if it were true. Well, I mean, it is really a hard thing to think about, but the issue is I simply don't think I simply cannot make sense of an afterlife while we have a temporary life that we have right now. I feel like if there is an afterlife, then there shouldn't be a temporary life. If there is judgment, then I find that judgment, no matter how you explain it, extremely unfair. We could have gone deeply into that much further, but we have discussed a lot about other things. I do not imagine how an afterlife could possibly be meaningful while this life is also meaningful. If there is only an afterlife that we go to, then this life that we are having and much of the stuff that we are creating in this life is very much meaningless. All the progress that we have made over thousands of years, all the wisdom that we have that we have gathered, all the things that we have built, the civilizations that have come forth, the great changes and revolutions and all the stuff that happened, everything that we have established over thousands of years is completely for nothing, because it all will go down for some supposed eternal afterlife. That simply does not make sense to me. But if there was some guy, some creator who created an afterlife and said, hey, I just create this so that people who die here can go there and hang out there forever, then I would think, yeah, okay, that sounds fine, as long as you don't judge people and send some of them to hell for not believing or for not being correct. You know.
Randall, is there anything that you can say quickly in response to that?
Well, it seems that my gladiator impression didn't hit home, because actually I said there, what we do in life echoes in eternity. And actually the whole point there is, I said there's a teleology, there's a direction or purpose for what human beings are and the ends for which we've been made, that this is the first chapter of our eternal lives. And it all carries on from here. And so let's get the first chapter right. And so, in fact, I thought this was a very easy question. If we assume that Christianity is true, it follows trivially that life is given new meaning, because life is about living in accord with the life of Jesus, loving your neighbor, loving God, being in right relationship with God, working to bring about his kingdom of justice and mercy and love and goodness. That seems to transform our understanding of reality if Christianity is true.
I don't think so. Why did God not just create everyone into the afterlife, into the heaven that we are supposed to go to, that we're supposed to aim for?
Well, this is another topic we could certainly talk about, but if Christianity is true, as I said, then it follows trivially that this is meaningful.
Okay,
Say, like,
let's try to move.
I have a major issue with that, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. This is a question for Randall, and we're able to get through some questions that are not sent in as super chats, which is great. And so this one is from Alpheus. Question for Mr. Rauser or anyone and everyone: how do we know that the Christian afterlife is true and not just pure speculation?
So there are some. Let's begin with this: that there are some claims that get thrown around, which really I think do qualify as pure speculation. And those include, for example, books that are bestsellers, which rise up the charts about people who claim to have visited heaven. So, for example, Todd Burpo wrote a book about 12 years ago, Heaven is for Real. And books like that. So that was based upon the alleged experiences of his 3 to 4-year-old boy, Colton. I think that there's some significant evidential problems with those books, and that they are largely just speculative. But in terms of beyond that, well, I gave an argument for the resurrection. I believe if you have grounds to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, well, then that's the first fruits of resurrection. That's a confirmation of the teachings and life of Jesus, which carries with it the second coming, the general resurrection, of which he was the first fruits, and so on. So there's that. Also, then generally, if you believe you have independent grounds to accept Christianity as true, well, then you have independent grounds to accept this story about the afterlife. So, it's part of a much larger and longer apologetics conversation.
So,
yeah, feel free to comment.
Add to that.
Yeah.
So, as I was saying earlier, we don't actually have. I don't see any proper reasoning based on why we should believe in an afterlife or why we should believe. So there is no reasoning there is no reason why we should believe in the existence of an afterlife, but the evidential ground, as far as I understand, depends on believing that there is a God. It depends on believing that Jesus rose from the dead, and so on, which are entirely different discussions that also deserve some skepticism and criticism. But that's right? That's how I understand it, Randall. I mean, there is no proper what was the question? Speculation. So there is no proper reasoning or evidence or proof. I know you don't like the word in this regard, to believe in an afterlife, but the evidence is rather based on the belief in God and the belief in Jesus who rose from the dead.
If there's no evidence for, you could say you've given no evidence against, so maybe you should just be an agnostic rather than having some pretty settled convictions about the afterlife, namely that there is none.
No, but I'm just trying to understand. So that is the thing, right? I mean, the proof that we have would be a proof for the existence of God or for the resurrection of Jesus, right? So if the proof for that didn't exist, then we wouldn't have any reason to believe in an afterlife in and of itself. Is that right?
No, there's much more. Again, we did talk briefly about out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, things like that. There's also some interesting body of evidence, anecdotal and otherwise, with respect to ghosts and all sorts of other things that are supportive of non-reductionistic understandings of the human person consistent with an afterlife. So it's not just one thing or another thing. There's all sorts of things. There's the questions about religious experience that people have, arguments from religious experience. And so, yeah, there's part of a longer conversation here. But the thing is that, again, time and again, I think we're bumping into is that you do have a worldview, right? And playing the perennial role of the skeptic, well, that's not good enough evidence for me. This isn't good enough evidence for me. Isn't really an accomplishment. It's just saying I'm not persuaded. But what you should be looking at is providing actual defeaters to engage with the evidence people do provide, and also providing arguments and evidence for the position you in fact hold about the afterlife, which I assume is something like naturalism.
No, what I'm doing is I'm not making any great assumptions or any great assertions here. I'm simply challenging a firm, an established belief and inquiring its evidences. I'm not saying there is not sufficient evidence. I'm not saying that I'm not satisfying with this evidence or that evidence. I'm saying there is no evidence. If there was evidence by definition, if there was proof, then I would look into that. People would be convinced. Yeah. It would be considered revolutionary, but there is no proof. I mean,
the way that you talk really sounds fundamentalistic to me. So that you talk in absolutes. Yeah, you talk in absolutes in terms of constantly you're reverting to the language of proof, something that would compel you. And if you don't find that, then there's no evidence at all. But hey, reality, life is all about degrees of ambiguity, degrees of evidence under which we take a step of faith and make a conviction. So if you think in these black and white categories, sure, you'll never be satisfied. But then, of course, your interlocutor can turn that right around on you and say, "Where's your evidence for your claims?"
Well, if I believe that there is a multiverse, if I believe that there are many universes outside of our universe, and that giants and gods and this and that live in those worlds, that would simply be a claim. That would simply be a belief that I have. But as far as I don't have any evidence, as far as I don't have anything to show for that, that is simply a claim with a lack of evidence. If I could believe in that, I could say, okay, it's not harmful. I could try to go out there and to find out if that is true. But as long as I don't do that, as long as I don't present a piece of evidence, actual evidence, and by evidence I don't mean things like this person said, that person said, this person said that this is so and so. By evidence, I mean actual evidence. If we don't have proper evidence, then it simply is a claim.
I've actually got a comment that I had pulled up and saved from someone called Ethos, who says claims are not evidence. So maybe this is a good time to discuss this claim for a little while and see what both of your thoughts are. Because obviously, I think, Apostate, I think you just sort of affirmed that you believe that claims are not evidence. And by claims, you mean like testimony from someone else. Like that's not. So maybe just expand on what you mean if you accept it.
Let me give you an example. I think it is actually very similar to what Christians believe regarding the resurrection of Jesus. But in Islam, for example, traditions about what Muhammad did in his life and what Muhammad said are a very fundamental core part of Islamic religion, Islamic belief. Now, when we look at those narrations called hadith in Islamic terms, we see that there are certain narrations, about 4 or 5 of them, which say that one night Muhammad went out among the people, and people wanted him to show a miracle. So he went out there and he pointed at the moon, or he looked at the moon and he said, "Behold," and the moon split in two, and everyone who was there saw that. And some people asserted that this must be magic. And people clearly say they saw one part of the moon go to this one side and one part of the moon go to the other side. Now, what we have here is that, according to that report, multiple people, everyone who was there, saw it. What we also have is that there is a chain of narrations of people who affirm that this narration is indeed true, that such a report exists, that people have actually made this observation, that people have delivered this observation. Now, if I want to trust evidence, if I want to see that as evidence, then I should believe that the moon was split in two in Muhammad's time, that is a miracle. But I don't, because what I see here is that there is merely a chain of people who tell a story from each other, a story that makes no sense, a story that there is otherwise no evidence for, a story that those people want us to believe. I don't have any evidence for that. I only have a group of people telling me something. And that is merely a claim. That is not evidence.
Okay, so I think we're almost out of time. I'm just going to make a kind of quick response here. Because the problem is that you sort of give this, but then you have this sweeping sort of statement about what constitutes evidence. In fact, however, testimony does constitute evidence. There is something called a principle of testimony. And the principle of testimony is that all things being equal, unless you have some reason to doubt or to question the testimony of another person, then prima facie you grant their testimonial evidence some weight. So it does constitute some degree of evidence. That's obviously recognized in a courtroom, which is why we have testimonial evidence in courtrooms. I think tacitly, it's testimonial evidence.
That's very different.
Look, I teach history. I understand what testimonial evidence is. Some of it is spoken,
you understand
some of it is written.
Very different.
Just let me finish. We're almost out of time. So the issue is, do you have some reason to doubt or to question particular testimonial evidence? And what you're providing here is you believe you have some degree of evidence to question this particular testimonial evidence. Fine. You can also have reason to question a person's evidence in the courtroom when they testify. But the point, nonetheless, is that evidence is prima facie, or testimony is prima facie evidence. And then you have to take a look at the evidence. Now, what concerns me is that I don't know that you've actually seriously looked at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.
There is no
but there is some degree of evidence there. I've certainly presented on it. Many others far smarter than I have as well. And rather than say, well, there's just no evidence, period, again, that's the fundamentalist mentality of black or white. You could say, well, there is some degree of testimonial evidence here. Paul's testimonial evidence that you find in 1 Corinthians 15, which you can date back to the 30s within months or years of the alleged events themselves, probably in AD 33. That is some weighty evidence that you find in 1 Corinthians 15. You have to think about it. You have to weigh it. You may ultimately not be compelled by it. You may not be compelled by Paul's conversion described elsewhere, such as in Galatians 1 and 2 and in Acts 9, etc. But it's still evidence. There's some degree of evidence there. It's sufficient to compel some and not others.
So unfortunately,
about what I think. The issue is that those are mostly just assumptions that you are conveniently making. But what we are seeing here, I looked into the evidence myself. I looked into the evidence of the resurrection myself. That is a whole different issue that we can discuss. I didn't even get to the evidence of that. What I'm talking about earlier was the evidence for an afterlife. But if we look at the evidence for resurrection, what we have is, if you teach history, then you should know that it is not that there is no historical consensus that Jesus rose from the dead. There is a consensus that that Jesus possibly existed, and that there are very specific things that possibly happened, such as that a person named Jesus lived, he was born, and he died at a specific time or was executed at a specific time. There is no consensus that he rose from the dead or that he appeared a few days later. What we have,
So I am going to have to jump in. Sorry, Randall.
Eyebrow raise. Yeah, I saw, but I have to say, so I know just like 10 seconds.
Well, let me ask you. Are you guys okay with going over? Are you guys okay with going over time?
I do have to get going in a couple minutes here, but I mean, I'm just going to say that the way Apostate Prophet you described that is that sort of a consensus of scholars say maybe Jesus existed. That's not a representative consensus. There's like 3 or 4 people who have like terminal degrees in history and are publishing in the area who take a Jesus mythicist view. And apart from that, I mean, even Bart Ehrman, he's just rebuts this, not a serious position. No serious historians, maybe you could count them on one hand, would seriously question whether Jesus existed or not.
Okay, let's get to, there was a few more super chats that were sent in, but we'll try to get through these quickly. This one is just for Randall. Is there any room in Christianity to deny a spiritual afterlife? Oh, there it is, afterlife, but believe in future bodily resurrection?
I did refer to Christian physicalists. Trenton Merricks is an example of a contemporary philosopher who's defended that view.
Van den Wagen.
Peter van den Wagen, another well-known one, of course. So that's the view that we are just material beings, that we die, that cease to exist during the intermediate state, and then we are reconstituted at the resurrection. So that is a view. There's a view of soul sleep represented in the Christian tradition, which sometimes means the soul exists, but it's cognitively inert, and sometimes it is consistent apparently with non-existence as well. So that is a possibility.
Okay, this one is from DC. We'll try to get through this one quickly as well, because I'm not familiar with this acronym here. What is both parties' thoughts on the theory that near-death experiences are just DMT being released by the brain before death?
I think DMT is or contains a certain chemical that is released during death and specific other states, also by taking a drug that is known as DMT. And there are some theories about that, but yeah, I haven't studied that enough.
Any thoughts, Randall?
A dimethyl tryptamine. I just looked that up. So
you sounded really smart.
Yeah, I know, for about 1 second. But I would say that the one interesting thing about out-of-body experiences is that they're significant because they do look to vertical evidence that the person gained knowledge apart from embodiment that they could not have had otherwise. And so that's what makes them veridically interesting and not subject to a sort of undercutting argument that would come from DMT in the brain.
Okay, so let's move into just some closing thoughts, and we'll get through these quickly because, Randall, I know you've got to go. So why don't we start with Randall, because you went first. Why don't we have you go first? Take about a minute or two and just share some of your closing thoughts in the discussion today. Then we'll move to Apostate Prophet, and then we'll close it out.
Can I quickly say something just to make a correction for something that I said a few minutes ago before we go on? I said as we were arguing in the heat of the historical evidence, I said that
so much
Jesus
heat.
That there was a consensus that Jesus possibly existed. That was not what I intended to say. I did indeed before argue on my own channel and elsewhere too that the consensus is that Jesus did exist. So what I meant to say was that Jesus did exist, not that Jesus did possibly exist. Just to correct that.
Sure. Okay.
Well, if he did exist, he also possibly existed.
Yeah. Definitely. All right. So closing thoughts. First of all, I appreciate Apostate Prophet, your statement at the beginning, that, hey, we're not here to get angry at one another or to trounce one another or anything else. This is a friendly conversation. I very much thought it was. I enjoyed it. We didn't get into some of the issues that I think are interesting, like moral objections to the doctrine of hell. We were sort of stuck into some of the more preliminary issues, which I nonetheless think are important, such as inclusivism and so on. Ultimately, again, I do think that the Christian view is not simply about fire insurance, something for the afterlife. It should transform how we live and act now, which I really sought to emphasize. It's to recognize that all life has a teleology. It has an end or direction for which it is going. History has an end for which it is going. It does bend toward justice. And understanding our lives in light of eternity should transform them and lead us to live out acts that are consistent with the life and teaching of Jesus.
All right, Apostate, let's turn it over to you about 1 to 2 minutes. Same kind of thing. Just summary thoughts on the discussion today.
So thanks first of all, Randall, again, and thanks, Cameron, for making this possible. As said at the very beginning, as also agreed by Randall, it was never my intention to defeat or to humiliate or to prove that I'm right. I am just seeking. I consider myself a seeker. I think it's the most satisfying thing to do in life. So I respect if people have certain beliefs about creation, afterlife, this and that, and I would never discourage anyone from believing in those things. I would say, hey, I appreciate that you are at least seeking something, or that you are satisfied with your beliefs, whatever it is. All we're doing is simply discussing to seek and to find out the truth. If you ask me, I think we are very much all equally ignorant. Of course, you will not agree with me on that. Maybe, I don't know. But we haven't even scratched the surface of the belief in an afterlife and what really happens after we die. We just discussed about a very little of what is there to discuss. We could sit here forever and discuss that. I would be certainly excited to do so. But yeah, as far as we have come, I simply do not find I do not see a reason to believe that there is anything but the life that we have, anything but the life that we know for sure exists. What I see is that I exist, people around me exist, we have minds, we have thoughts, we have the world that is around us, we build, we live a life, we try to be happy, try to flourish, and this and that. We do not have any reason or evidence to believe that there is something else after we die. It would be sure nice to believe in that. It would be nice to see all the people that we that die again in some other life, or to get some rewards for the things that we have done, or to see the people punished who have done horrible things. But I simply still consider that wishful thinking, unfortunately. Until I can be convinced otherwise, I will stick to that. And yeah, thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you guys both for coming on. Apostate, I have to say, I want to have you back on to do a discussion with an epistemologist, which I think, Randall, I mean, you guys got to an epistemology today, but I would love to have you have a discussion with a philosopher just purely on epistemology, because I think that may be at the root. And there's a saying that I love. It says, good epistemology covers a multitude of sins. I don't have the mug with me right now, but we actually do sell that mug on our Teespring. So if you're interested, you can go check it out. But I think it would be beneficial to have you have a dialogue. I mean, it doesn't have to be on this channel. I mean, we could even do this offline. But I don't know. I'd love to talk to you, or maybe you could have a conversation with an epistemologist. Because I think once that's ironed out, then I think a lot of these issues will be a little bit clearer. So I just had to say that. If I don't remember to say it later, I wanted to say it now.
Sure,
but we can talk about that later. Yeah.
I'm open to it. We can do that. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Because all right. I have 1,000 reasons why I think that would be great. But thank you guys both for coming on. Thank you for watching. If you're interested in this kind of thing, consider subscribing. Consider liking this video. Maybe even share it. That's a cool thing to do. Thank you guys for watching. And until next time, we will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you later.